Hi, my name is Sarah Bird. I'm an integrative nurse practitioner at Palm Health and trained in functional medicine. Today, we're going to talk about smart gut. So we're talking about all the ways that the microbiome influences our health, particularly our immune function, our metabolism, our mood, but can also be really helpful for prevention. Thanks for joining us. So what exactly is the gut? I always like to start talking about what we're actually going to be reviewing here today, because not everybody knows what it is. So the gut actually starts in the mouth. It goes down through the esophagus into the stomach, into the small intestine, then the large intestine, and then goes out. It also involves a lot of other organs. And the surface area of the gut, if you were to lay it out flat, would actually be equivalent to 2 tennis courts. It's much more permeable than, say, our skin barrier, because we need to be able to move nutrients in and out of that gut wall, as well as clear out toxins. It plays a crucial role in our health because it's really important for digestion, really important for assimilation of nutrients, and overall can really move us towards health or towards a lack of health and disease. So what is the microbiome? The microbiome is, in general, a group of organisms. So this group of organisms is in any particular environment, but today we're going to talk about the microbiome in different parts of the body. So it includes mostly bacteria, but also includes fungus and some parasites. In the human body, it's present in our skin, in our mouth, and in our eyes, as well as our gut. And it really plays a crucial role in determining our health. So in many ways, it can shape our body's healthy immune response or predispose us to disease. The microbiome cells, are the cells of the microbiome, outnumber the cells in our body by 10 to 1. So we have trillions of bacterial cells. The genes of the microbiome also outnumber our own human genes. So we have 23,000 human genes in our body, and we have 1 million bacterial cells. 95% of these bacteria are actually in the gut. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So although we have a microbiome in our eyes and in our skin, we're really focusing today on the role of the microbiome in the gut. So it really does a lot of things for our health. It helps to regulate local and immune function, regulates our metabolic pathways. So this has to do with maintaining a good, healthy blood sugar, absorption and production of cholesterol and amino acids. It regulates inflammation, and it helps to prevent infections. So we don't always think about bacteria being important in preventing infections, but we'll talk about how that works today. It also regulates our appetite and our bowel motility. It helps to prevent neoplasms in several different types of cancer, but particularly in the colon. It enhances our use of nutrients and allows us to synthesize vitamin K. So if we don't have a good, healthy microbiome, we can be deficient in vitamin K. And it also regulates a balanced mood. Imbalances in the microbiome are associated with a lot of different disease processes. So things like irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel, including ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, autoimmune illness and allergies, mood disorders, cardiovascular disease, diabetes and metabolic syndrome, even obesity, chronic fatigue and pain syndromes, degenerative diseases, particularly those that have to do with detoxification, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And really, if you look at the microbiome patterns in chronic diseases, there's dysbiosis that tends to follow a consistent pattern in almost all the chronic diseases that we've been able to identify the microbiome. Dr. Marty Blaser is a researcher who started looking at the role of the microbiome in complex chronic disease. And he found that the role of antibiotics is really fueling our modern plagues. He said that it is reasonable to propose that the composition of the microbiome and its activities are involved in most, if not all, of the biological processes that constitute human health and disease. And the mammalian immune system, which seems to be designed to control microorganisms, is in fact controlled by microorganisms. We really couldn't survive without these bacteria. So they play a really important role in our ability to eat, digest, breathe, detoxify. And the interesting thing is they were around long before we were and can survive just fine without us. But we really have a deep sort of mutualism with these organisms. And I hope that as we move through this, you'll start to see what Dr. Blazer was talking about. So we're really still starting to understand the relationship between the microbiome and immune function. We know that the interaction is one of the key ways that the microbiome plays a role in our health, and that the microbiome is really important for the development of the immune system. So when we're born, it's the bacteria that we are exposed to that act as educators for the immune system. And these educators help to create a set point between tolerance and reactivity. So if you have good, healthy bacteria around, that tells the immune system, okay, there's some friendlies around, we don't have to overreact to everything. But if you don't have a good, healthy immune system, that set point for tolerance can be way too low. And so the immune system will react to things that aren't dangerous to us. And when that happens, we start to get a lot of inflammation. And eventually, the immune system can start to attack our own tissues. And that's what we call autoimmune disease. Also, it's dynamic. So although it affects the development of the immune system, it can play a role later on in life as well. So if we have early life exposures, as you see here, such as antibiotics early in life, or the mode of delivery. So if a child is born via C-section, it doesn't get inoculated to the microbiome through the birth canal as it was traditionally, and that can lead to an imbalance in the microbiome. Antibiotics at an early age, we know, lead to some dysbiosis that can increase the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease. So there's a lot of correlation between early antibiotics and inflammatory bowel in adulthood. Additionally, if we continue to sort of accumulate pathogenic bacteria in the gut as we age, that can decrease our set point and change our tolerance. So it's really plays a key role in the development of autoimmune. And this, together with leaky gut, are kind of one of the preconditions that we see when people develop autoimmune disease. So what is leaky gut? Leaky gut occurs when we have an impaired mucosal lining in the small intestine. So when things are working well, you have a really good tight junctions between these cells, and you chew your food, it goes into your stomach where it starts to be digested, but really most of the digestion takes place in the small intestine. So as I said, when things are working well, you'll continue to digest your food, and then at an appropriate moment, the body will bring that food particle in and use it for nutrients and fuel. What you're not seeing in this picture is a thick layer of mucus that helps to protect this single cell layer of the gut wall. So we need this cell layer to be thin so that nutrients can move beyond it, but we need some extra protection because it is such a fragile layer. So the microbiome in the gut really help to produce that cell layer, or that mucosal layer. When we have an imbalance in the microbiome, that mucosal layer can kind of slough off, and we don't have that same protection. And then the gut is much more vulnerable to the insults that we expose it to on a daily basis, just based on our food and our environment. So these insults can be things like medications, ibuprofen, antibiotics, opioids. These are all really hard on the gut, but also things like pesticides in our food, microplastics, toxins in our environment. And when that happens, we get leakiness. Not only are food particles leaking through, but also other microbes and potentially larger undigested food particles. So when you get those larger undigested food particles leaking through, the immune system recognizes that they're too big and they shouldn't be there. So this would be like potentially like an egg protein, right? So then the immune system makes an antibody to that egg protein. And every time you eat that egg and you still have that gut leakiness and it leaks through, the immune system tags it with an antibody, which is just the immune system's way of saying, hey, we need to fight this thing. And then your immune system will actually start attacking your food, creating a lot more inflammation, both in the gut and systemically. So this is one of the ways that the microbiome can, or imbalances in the microbiome can predispose us to autoimmune. The microbiome also plays a big role in our mood. So the gut-brain axis is the name that we give to the bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut. So the central and the enteric nervous system. So this communication system links the emotional and the cognitive centers of the brain with the functions of the gut. In the past, we really thought of this as a brain on gut effect. So we had the perception that our brain would see stress, it would kind of send off the signaling for the body to react. And that signaling in the gut would create some GI distress. So, you know, people have stress, often have GI symptoms. But what we realized is that the influence is not just brain on gut, but as much, if not more, a relationship between the gut and the brain via neurotransmitters, neurohormonal signaling. And this neurohormonal signaling is really mediated very often by the microbiome. In one study that looked at this, they identified the ways that the microbiome play a role in the development of the central nervous system, very similarly to the way it plays a role in the development of the immune system. So in this study, it was done in 2004, kind of old by our standards now, but was one of the first studies to look at this gut-brain axis. And what they did was they examined the stress response in the autonomic nervous systems in mice without gut bacteria versus those with normal gut bacteria. So they're able to breed mice without any gut bacteria. And what they saw was that in these mice without a normal healthy gut bacteria, they had an over-exaggerated stress response as compared with the mice who had a normal healthy gut bacteria. Now, when they re-inoculated these mice with a good healthy microbiome, that over-exaggeration of the stress response was reduced, but not reduced to the level of a normal healthy stress response. So again, it's helping to teach the central nervous system how to react. And so we can see the ways that this may play into our resilience. If our microbiome is playing a role in our stress response, we need to make sure it's healthy in order to build resilience and stress management tools. Other studies have actually looked at the role of neurotransmitters because 80 to 90% of our neurotransmitters are actually produced in the gut. So another study in mice was done where they took two groups that had good, healthy microbiomes. They measured the level of serotonin. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter that really plays a key role in mood. So they measured the levels of serotonin in these two groups of mice. Then they removed the microbiome from one group and over time measured the levels of serotonin. And they saw a 60% reduction in the levels of serotonin in the mice where the microbiome had been removed. The good news is that when they put the microbiome back, they were able to reproduce the effect and have normal levels of serotonin. But again, if our microbiome are actually affecting our production of neurotransmitters, it's really important that we're paying attention to this, particularly when we're addressing well-being and mental health. Does the microbiome affect metabolism? Well, I'm sure you can guess that I'm going to say yes, it does. This study was one that was done in mice and humans. So what they did was they took individuals, pairs of twins, so they're genetically identical, but they chose twin pairs where one of the twins was obese and one twin was lean. And they took microbiome samples from each of the twins, and they actually did a transplant into mice. Then they fed these mice the exact same number of calories, the same number of activity, and they were able to show that the mice that got the microbiome transplant from the obese twin developed obesity. And the individual that the mice that got the microbiome from the lean twin maintained lean adiposity, so they didn't have overweight or obesity. And the question here is always, okay, we're showing this effect, but what is the mechanism? Why is that happening? So there are patterns of microbiome differences in those that are overweight or obese. So if we look at particular strains, we can actually see strains of certain bacteria that are present at higher levels in individuals that are overweight or obese. We also know that a high-fat diet with a lot of sugar and refined carbs and low in fat, low in fiber, changes the composition of the microbiome. It's very interesting. We call this the SAD diet, or the standard American diet. And fiber is just such an important part of this. And here it's a little bit of the chicken or the egg. Is it that the bacteria are growing because they're getting a lot of those sugar and fats? So the SAD diet actually feeds the bad bacteria and suppresses the growth of the beneficial bacteria? Or is that these individuals have these bacteria that send neurohormonal signals to the brain and really tell the brain, hey, we want more sugar? This is what's so amazing. You know, these bacteria can send messages to our brain, give me more sugar. Now, that's tied into blood sugar as well, but that is something that is a phenomenon that we're seeing happen. Additionally, our intake of calories can be affected by the microbes in our gut. So some of the microbes use more of our calories than others. So if we have more of those bacteria that use up more calories, we're going to absorb less calories into the body. Antibiotics also increase adiposity, meaning they can make us overweight. So those of you that are familiar at all with the cattle industry know that we use a lot of antibiotics in our cattle. And originally this was done to prevent infection, but they saw that cattle gained more weight when they were on antibiotics. So they've continued to use it for that reason, to help increase weight in these animals. And the thinking is that this is really because of the effect on the microbiome, increasing the weight of these animals. So, you know, when you get your steak with all that marbling, that's actually a sign of inflammation in that animal because there's so much fat deposition in the tissue. Additionally, epigenetics play a role in gene expression. So I haven't talked yet about epigenetics. Epigenetics is just the phenomenon that although we're born with a certain amount of, with certain distinct genome, we may or may not express those genetics based on our environment. Whether or not we express those genetics is called epigenetics. So it's the expression of our genes. And what we know is that the microbiome can actually regulate expression of human genes. So the microbiome may be able to increase tissue growth or increase the sort of the way that the body holds on to calories. And that could be playing a role in dysbiosis and obesity. And then finally, the presence or absence of certain gut bacteria affects insulin sensitivity. So we know that certain strains of bacteria actually can make the cells more or less sensitive to our blood sugar, and can also cause us to hold on to more cholesterol. So I've talked a lot about dysbiosis, and I wanted to define that so we are kind of clear on what that means and what it can look like. So dysbiosis just means any microbial imbalance of the gut that can include a lack of good bacteria. So we call these commensal bacteria, and they are beneficial for our health. We can have too many bad bacteria or pathogenic bacteria. We can have a lack of diversity. So diversity is really important. You want a lot of different kinds of bacteria. Or you might have a lack of richness in that bacteria. So you can think of this as like the same thing as diversity in the rainforest. So having a lot of diversity means you have a lot of different species. Having a richness of diversity means within each species, you have a very robust population. Another type of dysbiosis is having too many bacteria in the wrong place. And we call this SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And what happens here is because of antibiotic use or sometimes constipation, you can get sort of a backing up of things in the system, and you have a lot more bacteria in the large intestine than the small intestine, and that's how we want that to be. It's important that you have more in the large intestine and less in the small intestine. So if you get too many in the small intestine, it can really get in the way of digestion and absorption. They're very important for proper digestion and absorption, but in high numbers, they can lead to a lot of symptoms like bloating, gas, and acid reflux. You can also have yeast or fungal overgrowth. This also happens when we have high use of antibiotics. So if there's a lot of antibiotic use, that wipes out the natural population of the bacteria. And so those fungal or yeast populations are unaffected by the bacteria, and all the nutrients that are coming into our system are available to them. And so they can tend to overgrow, and that causes a lot of inflammation. Finally, we can have parasites that create an imbalance in the microbiome and are just inflammatory. And those come from a lot of different sources. So what causes dysbiosis? We can have a genetic predisposition or early childhood exposures, as I talked about earlier with antibiotics or the method of birth. Since we don't have much sort of power to change those things, I'm going to talk more about some of the other factors. So the standard American diet, that SAD diet, that's low in fiber, high in fat and refined carbohydrates, plays a really key role in dysbiosis. And that's because those things really tend to feed those bad bacteria. Fake sweeteners and preservatives are so harmful to the good bacteria of the gut. So things like sucralose, aspartame, what's in our diet sodas. When I see people sipping on diet soda all day, I just worry so much for their microbiome because it's like a constant assault on their gut bacteria. Additionally, high fructose corn syrup and sugar really feed those bad bacteria and suppress the growth of our normal, healthy, good bacteria. And I mentioned this earlier, but those bacteria that really thrive on sugar will end up sending those neurohormonal signals to the brain, trying to get you to eat more sugar. Medical treatments also play a role. So although we need antibiotics and vaccinations, and those are important, and good hygiene, they can change the milieu. We want to just be aware of the effect that they have on the gut. So often when our patients are on antibiotics, we will recommend a very specific type of probiotic supplement that will help to protect them from the effects of the antibiotic on the microbiome. Chronic poor digestion also plays a role. And this is particularly a problem with individuals who are on proton pump inhibitors like Prilosec. Those things tend to decrease our ability to really digest our food well, which isn't good for the microbiome. They also just decrease our ability to absorb our nutrients, and they decrease the acidity of the stomach, which is a really important barrier between the small intestine and all the bacteria that may be coming into our system. So if we don't have that acidity, we're more likely to allow pathogens to pass into the small intestine and sort of colonize in the gut. Chronic constipation can cause problems, as I explained, with SIBO. Stress, fear, and anger also play a role in the sort of the growth of the microbiome. So if we have a lot of stress, fear, anxiety, that promotes the growth of those pathogenic bacteria and suppresses the growth of those good beneficial bacteria. Infections are also can create dysbiosis. So if you've been traveling or you get that sort of Giardia infection that kind of wipes out the microbiome, that can be a precursor to dysbiosis and leaky gut. And then one of the most common sources, I think, are toxins. So cigarette smoke, alcohol, medications like ibuprofen. NSAIDs are really hard on the microbiome and the gut. And then pesticides on our food. So if we think about what we're doing with pesticides, we're putting them in a field of food to prevent things from growing on it. But if we ingest that pesticide, it's going to have an effect on the bacteria that are helpful in our gut. So there are a myriad of symptoms that come with dysbiosis. Obviously, a lot of digestive symptoms, so things like constipation, chronic diarrhea, bloating after meals, gas, abdominal pain, acid reflux or bad breath. And then if you notice that you're developing more food sensitivities because of that leaky gut effect, that's a clear sign of dysbiosis and leaky gut. But there also are a lot of signs of inflammation in the body that may not present as sort of digestive abnormalities. So we'll have patients come in who don't have any digestive symptoms, but have a lot of other signs of inflammation. And when we look at the microbiome, we see that it is imbalanced. Some of the more common ones are chronic rashes or acne, pain, joint and muscle aches, or just stiffness, allergies, particularly allergies that don't ever get better through the season. Autoimmune illness, as I talked about, and then things like metabolic syndrome and heart disease. Really, any sign of inflammation is usually tied to an imbalance in the microbiome. So what do we do? My first answer here is always food first. So we want pre and probiotic foods. We also want a lot of diversity in our foods, and then soluble and insoluble fiber. Diversity in our food will lead to diversity in our microbiome. They actually did a study on this in Ireland. So they wanted to look at the microbiome in aging populations as they went into short-term rehab and also long-term care from their homes in the community. And what they found was that there was decreasing diversity over time. So as they were in these facilities longer, the diversity of the microbiome went down. And they found that this decreasing diversity was correlated with a decrease in the diversity of the foods that they were eating. So, it kind of makes us stop and question the nutrition that we're providing, not only in our nursing homes and long-term care facilities, but also in our hospitals. If we're intending to help these people heal, but we're not providing them with much fresh produce, dark leafy greens, high fiber foods, are we really doing a good job of creating a healing environment? Lifestyle changes are also important for building a healthy gut. Because of the effects of stress and anxiety on the gut, we need to look at lifestyle changes, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And then we often will use supplements, or we will treat if necessary. So this is a quote from a nutritionist that said, "Diet has the most powerful influence on gut microbial communities and healthy human subjects. About 75% of the food in the Western diet is of limited or no benefit to the microbiota in the lower gut." And here is a study that kind of illustrates that. So this is a study that was done by Dr. Oz. We don't always think about him as being sort of our research guru, but he did a study that really exhibited the effect of food on the microbiome really elegantly. So in this study, he had two groups of participants, and what he had them do was eat either a totally plant-based diet, as you see here on the right side of the plate, or he had them eat an entirely dairy, animal protein, and egg-based diet. And he just had them do this for 3 days, which is, I think, the really powerful part of this study. And what he saw was that after 3 days, the individuals that were on the plant-based probiotic diet had an increase in beneficial bacteria, and those on the meat, dairy, egg-based diet saw a decrease in beneficial bacteria and an increase in the less beneficial bacteria. So pretty cool to see that even on, in just 3 days, we can have a pretty profound effect on the gut. The only catch here was that the effect ceased 3 days after they stopped the diet. So in both cases, the effect didn't last more than 3 days post-intervention. Now, I think that if you were eating a good, healthy diet for a longer period, the effect would last longer. But the point here is that we really just can't do this for a short time and then go back to our old diet. We need to have really this incorporated into our lifestyle. So you want to incorporate probiotic foods. Probiotic foods are those foods that have actual live cultures of bacteria in them. These include fermented foods like kefir and yogurt, sauerkraut and pickles, but you really want to get the kind that are in the refrigerated section because they are the ones that have live cultures. Kombucha is great. I love kombucha because it's really easy for individuals to access, and it's easy to incorporate into the diet. They usually come in pretty big bottles. So if you haven't had kombucha in the past, if you haven't tried it, I don't recommend drinking a whole bottle at once. You want to start out with, a third or half the bottle and just see how you do, because you can have sort of a digestive reaction to so much good, healthy bacteria. Kimchi is Korean food. Poi is Hawaiian. Miso paste is great. Making a miso soup out of a fresh miso paste is really great. And then tofu and tempeh. Soy has gotten such a bad rap, but the fermented soys are really good for us because of their effect on the microbiome. You just want to be sure that you're always buying organic. Prebiotic foods are just as important as probiotic foods. So prebiotic foods contain compounds that induce the growth or activity of beneficial microorganisms, such as bacteria and fungi. So these include things that are really high in those good fibers, things like garlic, jicama, onions, but also mushrooms, all the root veggies like cassava, malanga. And really, I consider all vegetables to be prebiotic because the more diversity you have in your veggies, the more diversity you're going to have in the microbiome. I've even heard people explain the relationship between fiber and the reduction. So there's a reduction in incidence of mortality from all westernized diseases in those individuals that have a high fiber diet. And the thinking has come to be that this is really because of the effect of a high fiber diet on the microbiome. Often we get the question, should I use probiotics as a supplement or should I use food? The answer really is you should always use food, and maybe you should use a probiotic supplement. And that really is an individual it's an individual basis. But what I can tell you is that often we will use probiotics because they can help to reduce inflammation very quickly in the gut. So for an individual who has inflammatory bowel disease, with a lot of inflammatory processes happening and a lot of symptoms in the gut, we'll put them on a pretty high dose probiotic. We also use probiotics to help shift the milieu of the microbiome to allow more of those good, healthy bacteria to grow. So you're not going to take a probiotic for 2 months and then stop and then have that same bacteria in your system a few months later. It's sort of like the diet. But you can create a milieu in the gut that allows the natural bacteria to grow in a way that will really be beneficial to your health. So sometimes we use it for a short time, but we may have somebody on it if they have a lot of inflammation for a longer period. Some individuals, when they start taking probiotics, will actually have a worsening of symptoms. They may get more bloating, more indigestion. And those individuals are usually people that have SIBO. So we will give them a very specific probiotic that won't worsen their symptoms. So prescription of probiotics is also pretty individualized. If we have tried food, or if somebody has more severe symptoms or a lot higher levels of inflammation, we sometimes have to treat the gut. And sometimes we have to treat that even beyond probiotics. So in these cases, we'll often do testing to try to figure out what the imbalance is. So we can often recognize, okay, this person has dysbiosis, but I'm not sure which of those different types of dysbiosis is the biggest problem for them. So we'll do gut testing and actually look at the microbiome to see what's going on. We may need to address the bad bacteria. So if you have a pathogenic bacteria in high amounts, we may treat that with an herb or with an antibiotic that's really focused, geared to treat that particular bacteria. And we also have nutrition programs and counseling to help people kind of navigate what foods are going to be helpful for them if they have a lot of food sensitivities. In severe cases, where people have had really serious infections like C. diff, an infection that you can get in the hospital that really wipes out the microbiome and can cause a lot of health issues. If we've tried a lot of these other things like supplements and foods, and we can't sort of rejuvenate the microbiome, we do consider fecal transplants. And this has been pretty successful, particularly for those severe infections. And it's even covered by some individuals' insurance now. I just had to include this because it always makes me laugh. And I think laughing and not taking ourselves too seriously is an important part of managing our stress and building resilience. And that's the last thing I'm going to talk about here. So often when we think about stress management, we think of adjusting our approach or the way we're thinking about things, or reducing those things that are stressful in our life. But, we're not going to be able to make our lives be completely stress-free. And often over time, what happens is we take on stress in the body, even though we may perceive it with the brain. The sympathetic nervous system gets going, and it really starts to send those stress chemicals through the body. And those stress chemicals are the things that have such a negative effect on the microbiome. So I really recommend body therapies to help calm the body down as a first step in stress management for the microbiome. So things that we have available at Palm, like the biomat or the salt room or the cell recharge PEMF mat, doing belly breathing or meditation or the biofeedback rebalance. All these things can really help to calm the body down, which I've seen to be the most effective first step in addressing acute stress. Of course, we want to utilize our coaching and our counseling that can really help with the thought aspect of our stress. Exercise is really good for the microbiome, particularly if we can combine that with pre and probiotic foods. And then finally, a plug for sleep. Sleep is so important in helping to maintain a healthy microbiome. We also know that if you have a good, healthy microbiome, you will sleep better. And so just remember, diversity is the key. We really want to eat the rainbow. Think about all the different colors, not just colors, but also try new vegetables, try new produce, try to incorporate things that you might not have tried in the past. It will benefit your health. And don't forget, as Hippocrates says, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you enjoyed the webinar. If you have further questions or are interested in seeking out more resources to find out more about your own microbiome and ways to benefit the microbiome, you can go to palmhealth.com, where we have lots of resources. Thanks and have a good day.